I'll give you the prompt. Okay, thank you. Jill, if we can start the YouTube stream, that would be wonderful. Thank you. Okay, Chair, we're now streaming live. I'll pass over to yourself.
Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Darlington Borough Council's Planning Application Committee. May I, before we start the meeting, out of respect for His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, can I ask everybody please to just have a few moments of silence before we start the meeting? Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. We start the meeting proper. Good afternoon. My name is Councillor Doris Jones, and I am the Chair of the Planning Application Committee. For the benefit of the members of the public, I will make necessary introductions, and I would appreciate if persons would show their hand as I mention you, please. We've got Mr. Dave Coates, who is the Principal Planning Officer, Head of Planning Department, Development Management and Environment. Mr. Coates is the Planning Manager. We've got Lisa Hutchinson, and Lisa is the Principal Planning Officer. We've got Mr. Andrew Errington, Council Planning Governance Lawyer. Are you with us, Andrew? And we've got Mr. Paul Dalton, and Paul is the Democratic Service Officer, and Paul's role is to minute the meeting and count the necessary votes that we take today. Would the elected members please show your hands? These, the elected members, make the decisions and they vote on each application. As the Planning Committee Chair, my role as Chair is to maintain order at the meeting, ensure that the meeting proceeds in accordance with the Council's planning policy. However, in the event of any vote being tied on any matter, I will have the casting vote. Thank you. Can we have the attendances, please, Paul?
Certainly, Chair. As has become probably quite traditional over the course of the last year now, I'll run through the list of the committee members, and if you can just indicate whether you're present at the meeting for the benefit of the public, please. Councillor Allen.
Present.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Clark.
Present.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Cousins.
Present, Paul.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Heslop.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Johnson.
Present.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Mrs. Jones.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Keir.
Present.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Lee.
Here.
Thank you. Councillor Lister.
Present.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Marshall.
Hi, Paul, I'm here.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor McCollum.
Present, sir.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Tate.
Also here, sorry.
Yes, okay, Councillor, thank you. Councillor Tostivan.
Present, Paul.
Thank you, Councillor. And Councillor Wallace.
Present.
Thank you, Councillor. It's a full complement, Chair. The whole committee's here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any declarations of interest on any item on the agenda this afternoon by members? No? Can we approve the minutes of the meeting, committee meeting on the 17th of March, pages 5 to pages 12?
Move them.
Thank you very much. Is that seconded, please?
Chair, can I just mention something? I'm terribly sorry that I didn't get to the last meeting, but I actually didn't have a working laptop.
Oh.
So it was pretty hard to get there. So that's why I asked Paul to give apologies. I think me and laptops don't get on together well.
All right, I can understand that, Councillor Lister. Whether that means we can count you in, I don't think so, but I'll leave that to Paul's discretion as he's the expert on that. All right. That takes us to item 4, which I will take us over to the Assistant Director of Law and Governance, Andrew Errington.
Sorry, Chair.
We agree that
I was just going to ask if we can just agree the minutes. I saw them being moved by Councillor Wallace and seconded by Councillor Johnson, but I just wondered if we can agree them. Thank you.
Yeah, all right. We have agreed, everybody. Sorry, I was chatting to Councillor Lister. Can we go over to Councillor Cousins? Your hand up. No, you're okay. Okay. Mr. Errington, please. Can you introduce the procedures, Mr. Errington?
Yes, Chair. We begin with the Planning Officer presenting their report to members. Once they've done that, if the ward member is present and wishes to speak, they will be invited to do so. Then if the applicant and/or agent is present, they will be invited to take questions from members. It's not an opportunity to make a presentation, it's just to answer any questions. The Planning Officer will then summarise matters and take questions from members. And members will then debate the matter and formulate motion or motions on which to vote and take a vote. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That takes us to the planning applications, and that is item 5A, which is land at the rear of 21 Barmpton Lane, Darlington. Mr. Coates, will you take us through that, please?
Thanks very much, Chair. Good afternoon, members. The first item is on page 15. It's an outline application. That's an acceptance, hopefully in principle, for the application. It's for 2 bungalows. All the matters are reserved for subsequent approval in an RM or reserved matters, apart from access. So it's the principle of development and the access we're actually talking about today. All of the matters are set aside for subsequent approval. You'll see very broadly the position of 21 Barmpton Lane to the northeastern part of the town. Next slide, please, Mike. That's a more focused zoom in. You'll see Harley Grove to the south, Barmpton Lane with a little offshoot, which gives direct access to quite an oasis, really, an open green area at the back of all of those properties. And you see the access, which is, apart from the principal development, the access that we're looking to assess today is through between those 2 houses in a fairly narrow track, admittedly, but between those 2 properties. The one to the south, which has the arrow pointing at it, owns that particular site, so that they are site owners. The area to the property to the north also there's a family interest there as well. Understandably, neither of those parties have objected to this scheme. Just as by way of background, there's perhaps a reason for those objections actually not coming in. Members will no doubt remember this was an application that was to be presented to them some months ago, and it related to an outline application for 5 houses. It's something that I asked officers to reconsider based on that particularly narrow access and the possibility of 5 dwellings exiting and entering between those 2 properties in such close proximity. It has been revised from 5, an outline for 5, down to an outline for 2, which on balance, my judgment is that that is much more acceptable intensity in terms of relation to the 2 adjacent properties. Next slide, please, Mike. That's another aerial slide. You'll see the area marked in purple hatched. You'll also see fairly wide-scale neighbourhood consultation marked by blue squares, and the 5 objections that have been received, which I'll update slightly when I move through the report, and you'll see those with triangles, upside down triangles, dotted around the periphery. The site itself is essentially a brownfield site, because there are some structures on there, including outbuildings and garages, but it's essentially it's a lawned area with fairly limited landscaping on it. The next slide, please, Mike. That's a representation of the site, and you'll see the purple areas marked with adjacent property on the adjacent property are in fact a single-storey development, and the brown or khaki-coloured areas are 2-storey. So you'll see there is a bit of a mixed bag in terms of the urban fabric in that part of the surrounding part of the site. I would point out that the proposal, should members be minded to grant it in outline, would be for bungalow development rather than houses. Next slide, please, Mike. This is a representation showing the 5 units, which was the previous consideration. I would stress this isn't what we're asking members to look at today. This was just as by way of comparison. This was the scheme as it looked in its previous form. So there's 5 units spread around the site, which I guess you'll appreciate are rather tight, and some of those proximity distance, particularly in relation to existing property around the site, is rather tight and don't comply with our normal standards and our proximity distances. Hence the rethinking of the scheme. Next slide, please, Mike. This is the outline application plan, which we're asking members to look at this time around, and you'll note it is for, whilst the access is very similar, it's been reduced to 2 bungalows with associated car parking and garaging, and all of those space standards between that proposal and adjacent property are fully compliant with our design guidance and our distance considerations. In terms of statutory objections, we have had no objection in principle from the highways officer. It clearly would be not an adopted road because of the nature of it and the width of it. It would be a private road, but there's no objection in principle from him to access it in that particular way. Nor are there any objections from the environmental health officer or indeed Northumbrian Water. We've spoken to our ecology advisor, who's based in Durham, who has also raised no particular objections. However, he has requested a landscape master plan, which is outlined in the report and certainly referred to as within the planning conditions. With regard to other consultation responses, initially on the first scheme, which you saw for 5 units in outline, there were 5 letters of objection that were received. There have been, as a result of this particular application for 2, there has been another 2 objections received, and they're actually, the reasons for those objections are actually set out in paragraph 8 on page 17, relating to poor access, increasing traffic, housing not needed, impact on wildlife. No objection to single-storey dwellings, but strongly object to dormer or 2 stories. That's the the basis of those objections as they've come in. The key area I would ask members to take into account is the principle of development, always the starting point, and the development plan, and whether this particular proposal complies with the relevant policies in the development plan. Our advice to members is yes, it does. It is well within any established housing development boundary and is seen to comply with the local plan, particularly policy E2. The other issue that I'd ask a key issue that I'd ask members to look at is the impact on visual and residential amenity. The site is lower. The green area you see on this particular site is lower than the surrounding area, and it would potentially be overlooked by bungalows and houses that are currently located in Harley Grove, Jesmond Road and Clarendon Road. Nevertheless, as I alluded to earlier on in the presentation, the proximity distances between those properties, even allowing for that change in land level, are more than adequately covered as set out in our design guidance. The other key issue I'd wanted to mention to you, Chair, members, is the access arrangements, and clearly, in my view, the previous scheme was too tight to service so many properties. I genuinely believe, following the helpful negotiation with the applicant and the applicant's agent more particularly, we've arrived at a satisfactory solution here where this road, narrow though it is, will service those properties adequately without any further problems. That's from a highway perspective. From a residential amenity issue, there is always the possibility when you introduce development to the back of this area where previously there's been none, there will be some sort of impact in terms of vehicle movement and noise and disturbance, particularly for the two properties located at the top of the site by the access. What's been agreed there is some screening to go along that part of the road, and also the residential window, I think it's a kitchen or perhaps it was a dining room, to be blocked up, so there's no obvious signs from within the house anyway of vehicles passing and repassing in that area. The other point I'd ask members to look at, which is something we've considered, is contaminated land on the site. Historically, it has always been a green space, so there's no suggestion that there is any significant contamination in the area. However, the Phase 1 contamination report has been undertaken by Solmec on behalf of the applicants, which has been looked at by our environmental health team, and who are satisfied that that report would suggest that there isn't any significant contamination. However, the environmental health team, as is usual, as is normal in these circumstances, has suggested further testing to be done, and you'll find that requirement within condition 14 and 18 within the recommendations, Chair. Impact on trees. If we could just move to the next slide, please, Mike. This is a photograph looking at the access, looking down the site between the two houses I was referring to. And the photograph on the bottom right hand is as you all enter into that access area and the view into the back garden, showing that garage and outbuildings I mentioned earlier on. Next slide, please, Mike. That's another general view to the houses around the edge. Next slide, Mike. And you'll see that rather fine monkey puzzle tree in the sort of kind of centre of the site. Because of the slight road improvements, unfortunately that tree is going to be lost, which initially I looked at that and I thought, well, does this render the site unacceptable in so many ways? But it's clear that tree is diseased, and it would have to be removed anyway, so that it didn't have any longevity in terms of how much longer it's going to be there. But nevertheless, there is a condition number 20, which has been put there, which relates to a arboricultural impact assessment. And it talks about trees, hedgerows, and how they would have to be replanted should an RM or reserve matter application come in. But that would be covered in the detail. Excuse me. As previously mentioned, our highways engineers raised no objections, but there is a requirement regarding construction management plan, and you'll find that in condition number 21 within the recommendations, Chair. There's no particular issues regarding flooding. It is the flood zone 1 area, and we've consulted with our local lead authority and indeed the Environment Agency and Northumbrian Water, none of whom have any particular issues. To conclude, Chair, the site is in outline. It's an outline application which everything is reserved for subsequent approval, apart from access, which you're asking members to look at today. The principle of development is fully compliant with policies. It's within the housing development boundaries. It's fully compliant with our highway colleagues following consultation. They have no issue with that. And on balance, accepting the fact we don't fully know the detail yet, other than the fact it's going to be 2 houses rather than 5, we consider that the movement or passing and repassing of vehicles along that relatively narrow road, which will be slightly improved, won't have an adverse impact on the 2 adjacent properties either side of the access, at the top of the access. So the recommendation, Chair, is to grant outline planning permission. I will, if I may, just draw your attention to 2 or 3 important conditions within that list. One of which is condition number 14, which is prior to the commencement of the development and any site investigation works regarding land contamination. That is a key one. And conditions number 15, 16, 17 and 18 run through that remediation issue. That's something I would bring your attention to. As previously mentioned, condition number 20, detailed survey of trees and hedgerows has to be undertaken. And then condition number 22, it's the bricking up of the ground floor window at the side of number 21 Barmton Lane. Now that is purely from a residential amenity issue, so it's not too obvious that vehicles will be passing and repassing between the 2 houses. So the recommendation is to grant planning permission, Chair, subject to those conditions. Thank you.
Councillor Kerr, as the ward councillor, would you like to come in?
Thank you, Chair. No, I haven't had any representations from folks on this. I think when it was 5, there were a couple of people had concerns, but I've not heard anything since the change to 2. So I think we'll take it through as per normal on what the members consider correct and right.
Thank you, Councillor Kerr. We do have the agent here, but as there are no questions to the agent, then there's no need to bring him in. Any questions for the agent, anybody? Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. There's a reference to footpaths in the report. Are any of these rights of way? That's one question. The other question is that it seemed as though Northumbrian Water were holding back because the information that had been given wasn't adequate. So a couple of questions there, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Coates, do you want to answer those, or shall I bring the agent in?
Certainly, as far as the public footpath issue is concerned, Councillor, there are no public rights of way through the site at all. And regarding the Northumbrian Water issue, perhaps that's something we can ask directly to the agent, if we may.
Yes, Mr. Applewhite, would you like to come in?
Chair, apologies. I wasn't aware that Northumbria Water had raised any particular issue. My understanding is they're content with the scheme as it stands. Certainly in terms of linking to sewerage and water facilities, that will be a matter to be dealt, it's a detail to be dealt with through the Reserve Matters application. But I'm not aware that they've raised any particular issue at this point. Okay. For example, saying connection isn't possible. They haven't raised that issue.
Right. Okay. Happy with that, Mr. Johnson. Councillor Johnson.
Yes.
Okay. Councillor Lee. Councillor Lee.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Chair. Seems a nice application all in all. The densities are right, both within the site and certainly without it, around it, I should say. I'm just interested, as we're looking to approve the access, whether Mr. Hepplewhite would sort of talk us down that road, coming in from the main road in relation to the widths of the access. We saw a photograph earlier between two houses of a predetermined width, and then perhaps you could give us some indication what that width is, and then talk us down to the site itself, because from the sketch we have got on page 29, it seems to narrow quite a lot before it opens up. So what dimensions are we actually talking about here?
Mr. Hepplewhite, would you like to answer?
Thank you.
Chair, apologies. I'm working from a laptop. I don't have the plan in front of me. From memory, I mean, it's a driveway, but it's a fairly wide driveway at present, and wider than the norm. Yes, there is a slight pinch point at one point towards the rear of number 21 and 21A to the north, and then it widens again. But on that drawing there, I mean, you've got a relatively wide driveway. Beyond, once you get into the actual site proper, there is a footway to be provided or shown to be provided along the northern side. The widths are, standard for this form of development, and no less than would be normally acceptable. Indeed, the highway engineer has not raised any issue in that respect.
Arthur, would you like to? Where's he gone?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Certainly, I do have those widths to hand for Councillor Lee. In that the driveway is intended to be 4.1 metres wide, which is a nationally recommended or recognised, I should say, standard for a driveway. It's actually wide enough to enable two-way passage of cars. Our own Tees Valley standard is 3.7 metres, so this actually exceeds that with a reasonable margin of safety, I would say, given that it's increased to 4.1. There's also reasonable clearance between the nearest building as well, which is number 21, Barmpton Lane. What we'd recommend for a highway on a 30-mile-an-hour road, we'd recommend a 0.45 metre minimum clearance between any solid object and the moving carriageway. Given that the speeds are going to be very low through that driveway, the clearance of 0.6 metres is considered perfectly acceptable. Another point I think perhaps worth mentioning is you can see on the plan that's indicated on screen, there's a driveway to be reinstated for number 21 Barmpton Lane. There's an historic access there, and at some point the parking arrangements for number 21 have been relocated to the rear. So this proposal actually removes those vehicle movements associated with number 21, brings them back onto the historic access on 21 Barmpton Lane. So in effect, it's an increase of vehicle movements of just one dwelling rather than two. So we're offsetting one with another. So hopefully that clarifies things a bit for you, Councillor.
Thank you, Mr. Howson.
That's fine, thank you.
If there are no further questions, I'm going to bring Mr. Coates in to summarise the application, please. Dave.
Thank you, Chair. Only very briefly. I think we've covered all the salient points, and certainly Mr. Howson's covered the highway aspects very clearly. bottom line here is that starting point, the development plan, does it comply with it in terms of housing in this particular location? The answer to that is clearly yes. There is it's within the housing development boundaries, so the presumption is in favour of granting planning permission, unless there are any justifiable reasons why we should move away from that. And my advice to members is that I can't identify any reasons, material reasons, to move away from the development plan position. We are talking about an in principle decision, which covers the access as well, and quite rightly we've had a debate and discussion about that, which I think is settled. A number of the other details will come within a reserved matter or subsequent application, should members be minded to grant this today. There would be little point in granting an outline permission where we weren't reasonably confident that we'd be able to agree the RM details, the reserved matter details, at some future date. And based on the helpful indicative plan that's shown on the outline drawings, I'm satisfied that a scheme can be drawn up at a detailed level, which would meet all our detailed requirements, and something we could, with a degree of confidence, recommend granting planning permission for. So for all of those issues joined together, Chair, as I say, the recommendation is a firm approval. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Wallace, I see you've got your hand up.
Yes, can we move something now, Chair? Is that appropriate?
That is appropriate, Councillor Wallace.
I'm happy to move the officer's recommendations, Chair. I'd certainly concur with the comments made by Councillor Lee earlier. The only reservation I would have had was if this had been on the main part of Barmton Lane, I'd have been worried about increased traffic movements, given that Barmton Lane could have an addition of 5,000 plus additional vehicle movements a day if Skirningham goes ahead, but that isn't the case. I think it's a well thought through plan, and I'm happy to support it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Do you have a second, Councillor Wallace?
I'll second. Oh.
Seconded, yeah.
Who seconded first? Who
Doesn't
was
matter.
first? Does it not matter?
It doesn't matter.
Thank you. Paul, would you like to take the voting on this amendment then, please? As there's no other amendments, nobody wants to move anything else. No? Thank you. Councillor Lee, your hand's up. Have you just forgot to put it down? All right.
Okay, if there's nothing else to be moved, Chair, we are
Yes,
voting.
please, Paul.
Yep, we're voting on the granting of outline planning permission, subject to the 22 conditions outlined on pages 22 to 27 of your papers. And I'll just go through and take the vote as per usual. So if you can indicate whether you're for or against, please. Councillor Allen.
For.
Councillor Clark.
For.
Councillor Cousins.
For.
Councillor Heslop.
For.
Councillor Johnson.
For.
Councillor Mrs Jones.
For.
Councillor Keir.
For.
Councillor Lee.
For.
Councillor Lister.
For.
Councillor Marshall.
For.
Councillor McCollum.
For.
Councillor Tate.
For.
Councillor Tostervin.
For.
Thank you. And Councillor Wallace.
For.
Thank you very much. That's voted for unanimously, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Members, that takes us to the next item, which is item 5B, removal of hedge and direction of 1.9 metre rear of property of respective application 5 Evesham Grove. Lisa, I think you're going to do this one, aren't you?
I am, Chair. Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, members. Could I have the next slide? Thanks, Michael. So this shows the general location of the site. It's number 6 Evesham Grove in the northern end of Herworth. It's a detached property on a cul-de-sac just off Round Hill Road, with the rear of the property in its garden backing onto Round Hill Road. If we could just move on to the next slide. So this shows it in more detail here. So the location of the fence is edged in red, just adjacent to Roundhill Road there. So it's a retrospective application, as the chair mentioned, for the erection of the fence in the location shown in red, and that's following the removal of a hawthorn hedge, which formerly was in that position and formed the rear boundary of the property onto Roundhill Road. So what's been erected is a 1.9 metre high vertical timber boarded fence to form the boundary onto Roundhill Road following the removal of that hedge. And if we can just move on to the next slide there, Michael, please. So this shows it in aerial form, with the neighbours consulted shown by the blue square, 3 objections received, none in the immediate vicinity, and I'll come back to those shortly, but if we can just move on to the next slide, and this will show the fence in situ. So it's the dark stained fence that sits now between the hedgerows of and trees of the remaining property, but there were no trees removed here. It was just the hedge. And what I would stress before we just move on to consideration is that the removal of the hedge itself did not require planning permission. Hedgerow regulations specifically exclude domestic hedges, or hedges either within a domestic curtilage or forming the boundary of a domestic property. So really all we're asking members to look at this afternoon is the acceptability or otherwise of the fence itself in terms of its impact on visual amenity, any issues of residential amenity and highway safety, which I will we'll run through with you shortly. But just in terms of the responses we've received, they're set out on page 32. No objection in principle from the council's highway engineer, no comments from Herwith Parish Council, and 3 letters of objection from residents, not immediate residents, but residents elsewhere in Herwith. And they are raising issues about the unsightly nature of the fence and it being out of context with the surrounding area, the removal of the mature native hedgerow, which has disrupted the coherent look of this part of Roundhill Road and removed habitat, and creating a precedent for other households to do the same. And one of those objectors has written in again just to reiterate the points that they've made. So that's an additional comment that we've had since the agenda was prepared. So obviously keeping that photograph on the screen, as I said, the issue really, or the consideration, relates to the fence itself, not the loss of the hedgerow as such. So as you can have a look around on that, or perhaps see on that screen, there is a variety of different boundary treatments along Roundhill Road. Obviously that's one of the main routes out of Herwith, heading northwards towards Neasham Road and the A66, but on the opposite side you'll see a mixture of low walls, hedges, fences of varying materials and height. And in terms of this fence, it's a simple vertical boarded timber fence that's been stained dark brown, similar height to the hedge of either side, or at least the hedge it replaced. And as such, we don't have any particular concerns about its impact on the character and appearance of the surrounding area. Just picking up on the points people have made about loss of habitat, it's a slightly unusual situation here that that fence and the hedgerow and trees form the rear boundaries of those properties on Evesham Grove, and some properties have actually erected fences behind that to sort of maybe form a more secure boundary. So this applicant or this property does have another fence behind that, so the intervening area really will be left to grow. There's no access to that, and to create sort of an untouched area of habitat. The applicant also points out that there is a gap of approximately 15 to 20 centimetres at the bottom of the fence, which would allow small animals such as hedgehogs to wander through. Because of its position relative to other neighbouring dwellings, there's very little impact, or no impact, in fact, on residential amenity, and likewise no objection in principle from the highway engineer in terms of impact on highway safety. So the conclusion and recommendation on pages 33 to 34, Chair, is to grant permission for the retention of that fence, subject to just one condition, that it be maintained a dark oak colour in perpetuity. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Lisa. Councillor Toscafin, you're the ward councillor. Do you want to come in at all on this?
No, I have no comments, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hallen, you've got your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. It's just a point of clarification, please, Lisa. I'm just wondering why, when this is not illegal, he's well within, or they are well within their legal rights to do this. Why has this particular issue actually come to our committee?
Through you, Chair, sorry, I probably should have clarified when I was explaining about the hedgerow regulations that it's actually the fence itself, because it's greater than 1 metre in height adjacent to a highway. That's why it requires planning permission. So that's why why the applications have been requested, and obviously a result of that, we've had the requisite number of objections. That means that it's a committee item. So sorry,
Right,
I should have
so
clarified that.
it's
in my
due to the
presentation.
fence height.
It's
then.
the fence height, yes.
Yeah.
Had it been 1 metre in height, it wouldn't have required planning permission and it wouldn't be up for discussion, but it's the height of the fence relative to the highway.
Nobody has a fence 1 metre high, do they? It's just not worth it.
All right, thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
There are no further hands showing. Take it, no further questions. Lisa, are you summarising up on this, or have you done all that?
I'm not sure there's much more to say, Chair, but
There isn't.
no.
Okay. Can we move the officer's recommendation? Does anybody have anything for? There's a hand there, but I can't see whose it is. It's got number 17 next to it.
It's Councillor Kieran. I'll move the officer's recommendation, Chair.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder for that?
I'll second it.
Thank you. Any further things anybody wants to move? No. Paul, can you take the vote, please?
No problem, Chair. So we're voting that planning permission be granted, subject to the single condition that's outlined on page 34 of the papers. Again, if I can just go through the names of the members of the committee. Councillor Allen.
4.
Councillor Clark.
4.
Councillor Cousins.
4.
Councillor Heslop.
4.
Councillor Johnson.
4.
Councillor Mrs Jones.
4.
Councillor Keir.
4.
Councillor Lee.
Against.
Councillor Lister.
4.
Councillor Marshall.
4.
Councillor McCollum.
4.
Councillor Tate.
4.
Councillor Tostovan.
4.
And Councillor Wallace.
4.
Thank you. That's 13 votes for the motion, Chair, 1 vote against. The motion is therefore carried. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Paul. That takes us to item 5C, which is Unit 1, Weir Street. Lisa, it's over to you again.
Thank you, Chair. This item is on page 37 of the report. The slide in front of you shows that the general location. So it's number 1 Weir Street, and an application for the change of use of an existing building from a storage and distribution use. So that's a use class B8 to a car showroom, which falls within a sui generis use. And just for clarification, that's a use that doesn't sort of fit comfortably with any of the defined uses within the use classes order. It's an existing building. It's one of 3 industrial units. Unit number 1 is edged in red there, and units 2 and 3 are the remaining part of that building southwards. So they're located on Weir Street at its southern end, close to its junction with Garden Street. You can see the River Skerne runs eastwards to the rear of the buildings, and the surrounding area is generally commercial industrial use, although there are some residential properties close by, most notably a dwelling known as Skerne View, which is attached to the north side of number 1 Weir Street, and then Skerne Studios, which are located to the south of that group of 1 to 3 Weir Street. So as I mentioned, it's a change of use of that building to a car showroom. No external alterations are proposed, but it would be an internet-based car sales type business. The cars would be stored in there and displayed in there, but customers would be able to view the cars for sale on the internet, and then would either come and view them or collect a car that they'd chosen to purchase by appointment only. There would be a small office created internally within the unit, and there would be some general sort of cleaning and polishing of the cars taking place inside as well. The applicant proposes the hours of opening would be between Monday and Friday, 8 AM to 6 PM, between 10 o'clock and 4 o'clock on a Saturday, and with no openings on Sundays and bank holidays. And just by way of a bit of background, those 3 units, 1 to 3, were recently granted permission to be used for B8 storage and distribution uses within the last year or so, but this use of unit number 1 it doesn't fall within that B8 use, and that's obviously why the application has been submitted. If we just move on to the next slide, please, Michael. So this shows it in aerial form, the blue squares showing the extent of the neighbour consultation exercise, and the red triangles being where the objections have been received. So 3 objections received from the residents of one from the resident of Skerne View to the north, and 2 residents of Skerne Studios to the south. I'll just run through those very quickly, and they're set out on page 39 of the report. In terms of technical consultees, so highway engineer and environmental health officer, no objection in principle, subject to a number of conditions that we'll run through in the main part of the report. And obviously the site being in close proximity to the River Skerne falls within flood zone 2. However, the Environment Agency have raised no objection to the proposed development on the basis that it doesn't increase what they term the vulnerability of uses, so of the use to flood risk. So there's no objection from the Environment Agency. 3 letters of objection, as I mentioned, from nearby residents, and they have concerns about the use escalating into a full and working car dismantling operation with noise, disturbance, oil spillage, etc. taking place. And just in response to that, what I would say is that the use proposed wouldn't permit that sort of use. That would then take it into a different use class, which in itself would require permission. Concerns about vehicles, vans, lorries, customers parking and preventing access to the surrounding properties. That it will turn a relatively clean, calm, pleasant and noise-free environment into an area polluted by loud noises, car fumes and cars spilling out onto the road. Concerns about these activities spilling out onto a weekend. A car sale room would not improve the surrounding area. Concerns about the proximity of the residential property to the external, the internal wall of Unit 1 and a resultant increase in noise levels. Concerns about customer parking. Would subsequent applications follow for the remaining 2 units? There are sufficient car showrooms within Darlington, and also concerns about how this would impact on the wider regeneration of this part of Darlington. There has been a further comment received, and that is just a reiteration of one of the letters of objection that we've had. They would like their comments reiterating. So as I've sort of set out, it was concern about future change of use applications, concern about how this part of Weir Street falls within a wider employment area, and again concerns about litter, noise, debris and the impact on the wider regeneration of the area. So those are the comments that we've had, and as we go through the report I'll set out how those issues or those particular concerns have been addressed by planning condition and draw your attention to those. If we just move on to the next slide, Michael, before I do so, and it just so that's just in Unit 1. So that's just the internal layout, no changes there, and no changes to the exterior. And just the next slides, I think this will probably show a photograph of the site. So it's the central building on the top slide. So it's the cream and blue coloured building. That's unit number 1. And the brick building to the left there, that is the residential property Skerne View. And perhaps the bottom slide shows the 3 units in more detail, but just to confirm that unit 1 relates to the cream and blue coloured building to the left of that group. So in planning policy terms, the application site is located in what is known as a Valley Street employment area, and that is an allocation in the 1997 local plan, and there's a policy within the local plan which states that within this employment and other employment areas, B1, B2 and B8 uses, so that's office, light industrial and where storage and distribution uses would be acceptable subject to certain criteria being met. Now this use is as I've described, is a sui generis use, so that doesn't fit within any of those particular uses and requires planning permission, obviously. So on the face of it, that would be contrary to that particular policy, but obviously the starting point is a development plan. If that doesn't comply, then the next point is, are there any material considerations to be taken into account? And in this case, there are a number of quite weighty considerations, which I'll explain. So this building, or the three buildings, have historically been used as a gymnasium for quite a number of years, which was a non-industrial use, and has only recently been granted permission for a B8 use. In addition, there are a number of other car showrooms within the wider Valley Street employment area, and it's not a use that would be uncommon or unusual in this sort of area. So that weighs quite heavily in terms of its favour. And the loss of a B8 use wouldn't harm the overall sort of range or number of B8 units elsewhere within the borough or the immediate vicinity, because there is a general sort of surplus of sort of employment land and buildings within this area and within the wider Darlington area as well. And these factors can be given quite significant weight in the planning balance. And for that reason, officers consider that this kind of use would be acceptable in this location as a matter of principle, and those material considerations would allow us to sort of set aside that on the face of it policy objection to this use. And I've mentioned the proximity of residential properties, and it's a rather unusual situation, I think, that you have industrial units sitting in very close proximity to residential properties. And that was taken into account in considering the previous applications for the B8, the storage and distribution use of these buildings. And there were some quite specific conditions in terms of opening hours, or hours of operation rather, etc., that sought to limit activities so that the two could, for want of a better word, live side by side, and the units could operate without adversely impacting on the residential dwellings nearby. So again, it's proposed to include an hours of opening condition or an hours of operation condition, and that is condition 4 on the recommendation. In addition, quite importantly, this will operate on an appointment-only basis, which will limit the number of visitors to the premises, and therefore there's unlikely to be significant comings and goings of vehicles or residents, customers at any one time that would impact adversely on residential amenity. And in addition, there's a condition that would also restrict it to a car showroom use only. Environmental Health have considered this and have advised that a condition be attached, and that's condition 6 in the recommendation, restricting the installation of any plant or machinery at the premises that might generate noise without the prior approval of the local planning authority. So overall, taking those conditions into account, it's considered that the use can operate in this location without adversely impacting upon the amenities of surrounding properties. Highway safety or parking access, that was raised by objectors, but the view really is that it's a modest operation and an appointment-based operation as well, and as such it's not expected that there'll be significant traffic generated by the use. There is parking close by at the Garden Street car park. There's also on-street parking on John Dobbin Road as well. So customers would be able to use these parking facilities nearby without causing obstruction or nuisance to nearby dwellings. And clearly, there are not clearly because you can't really see on that photograph, but there are double yellow lines along Way Street which are in place and should offer assurance that vehicle parking shouldn't be problematic in that area. So on that basis, and the highway engineer raises no highway objection to the proposal. I've mentioned about flood risk, no objection from the Environment Agency. In terms of character and appearances, there's no external alteration. There's no particular impact. So the recommendation, Chair, is to grant permission, and that's on page 43 to 44, subject to a number of conditions, which I'll just highlight those key conditions. So condition 3 is that it to be used for a car showroom only. Condition 4, the hours of operation, as I set out earlier. Condition 5 is that there is some land opposite the gravelled area that you can see on the photographs is also in the ownership and control of the applicant, so none of the activities can spill out onto that land, and that no plant or machinery be installed without the approval of the local planning authority. So as I say, recommendation is to grant, subject to those conditions. Thanks,
Thank you
Chair.
very much, Lisa. I don't think we have the ward councillor here for speaking, do we?
Yes, you do.
Okay. Go ahead.
I haven't been approached by any residents, so I've read all the stuff in the report. I personally don't have any objection to this. I think it's quite innovative with the online booking and so on. So,
all right, thank you, Councillor Lister. Councillor Johnson, you put your hand up. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. A question on the residential amenity. I do notice that one of the properties, residential properties, is sharing a wall with this development. If it's a single wall, it's highly likely to pick up most of the noise that has been generated in the development, whether it's just a simple radio or whatever. I don't know whether we've sort of thought about this particularly well.
Lisa, do you want to answer that?
Yes, I can do. Thanks, Chair. Environmental Health have looked at the application, as they did do with the previous application for a B8 use in the fairly recent past, and they haven't specifically recommended any conditions requiring sound insulation. I think due to the nature of this use, which is fairly low key, it's the display of vehicles with some sort of polishing and preparation of the vehicles as well, in conjunction with the hours of opening and other restrictions on activities there. I think their view is that those conditions should be enough to maintain the amenities of that property in particular.
Thank you, Lisa. Councillor Lee, you're next.
Thank you, Chair. It's a shame that we couldn't. Could we not ask them to actually do sound insulate that wall, Lisa? Because there's nothing worse. I remember when that application came through. It was a strange application many years ago, which I think Mr. Coates would agree, that someone actually converted that little building, which was an industrial building, into a lovely house overlooking the River Skerne. And there was, at that time, some hope that some of the other units would be developed as well. So, just taking Councillor Johnson's, I would like to suggest a condition, so we do insulate that inside of the Unit 1, so the neighbours can get a bit of peace. But the reason I asking a question, Chair, is that Weir Street is described on page 39 as a narrow cobbled back lane with double yellow lines running its length down both sides, as Lisa has clearly said. And quite rightly, it's an appointment-only operation with local parking nearby, which seems to find. But I'm just wondering, it might just be speculative, really, but in a lot of, I accept that it's a small unit, but cars normally are delivered on large lorries. A lot of people who buy cars in the business will buy it from wherever, and that they tend to be delivered with these ginormous car delivery lorries. And I'm just wondering how that could be satisfied. Well, first and foremost, is that are the cars going to be delivered in that way? And if they are delivered that way, how can that be accommodated on that car parking area?
Lisa, do you want to answer that, Lisa?
Okay, I'll answer what I can. I mean, I don't have any information to hand about how the vehicles are going to be delivered. Perhaps Arthur might be able to advise in terms of what the legalities are with regards to unloading and loading on the highway. I mentioned, though, just before that condition 5 of the recommendation does prevent any activities sort of spilling out onto that gravelled area opposite, and that is in the ownership and control of the applicant. But perhaps
breathing down there, Mike.
I'm not sure whether it wasn't me, Chair, but perhaps Arthur could give some advice in terms of what they can legally do in terms of loading and unloading on the highway, if that's possible, Chair.
Certainly, yeah. Thank you, Lisa. As Lisa, really, I'm not really aware of any specific arrangements for deliveries regarding vehicles. But the legality of loading and unloading on double yellows is that it's perfectly legal and legitimate, providing that activity is actually taking place. So as long as there is active evidence of loading and unloading, that wouldn't be a sort of enforceable action. Under the previous B8 use, we have had sort of problems with that. In that I think it was some sort of clothing business, and they were actually loading and unloading a lorry for some number of hours, and that was causing some problem. So with regard to that, I think that this is sort of betterment, and I couldn't imagine that it would take 8 hours to unload a car from a transporter. But I think ultimately we do have the fallback position, and that we could further impose restrictions that prohibit loading and unloading as well, which is the double yellows with the blips along the edge of the road. But I genuinely think it will be better over the existing B8 use, which has been somewhat problematic. Thank you, Chair.
So Chair, can I just follow that up? So are you saying that it would be safe to load and offload cars on that road? I mean, that's the point. I'm not trying to put a restriction in front of the developer. I'm all for it, but I'm just looking at the safety aspect of offloading and possibly loading cars onto one of these large vehicle delivery lorries. Thank you.
In all honesty, Councillor, I think it's unlikely they would unload a car transporter in that location. I think they'd find a more convenient place like Chestnut Street car park or an adjacent road. I think it's very unlikely that it would be convenient and therefore likely to be done directly outside that premises. Thank you.
Councillor Johnson, I see you've got your hand up again.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the shared wall business. Are we saying that our officers have said that there'll be no transmission of noise through this wall, which will affect the residents?
Lisa.
Thanks, Chair. I think what Environmental Health have said is that with the conditions in place and the use or the nature of the use involved, that isn't a particular issue or an area of concern to them. There may be some transmission of noise, but during those hours, that is at a level where in that location you would perhaps expect a degree of background noise. So that's sort of the Environmental Health's position on that.
If I didn't have any noise, I wouldn't be happy to have any background noise coming at me because of this change. I think I would move an amendment to add a condition that this wall be sound insulated.
Do you have a seconder to that, Councillor
I'll
Johnson?
I'll second that, Chair.
Right.
Chair, for me.
Can I bring in Dave Coates?
Yeah, sorry to jump in, Chair. I think what we need to be guarded of here is that there is a use that they're seeking to introduce, which is likely to be quieter than the actual authorised use of this building itself. So which could be, as Lisa's alluded to, some degree of betterment here by using or implementing this permission. We're actually penalising somebody for actually potentially making something a bit better than it actually is at the moment. So we just need to be careful, I would suggest. The other thing is that when you impose conditions of this nature, it would have to be evidence-based, would be my advice. And at this moment in time, I don't believe we have that evidence base from our noise experts who haven't raised a particular issue. So in the absence of that evidence-based approach, I think if members were to apply a condition to any consent, any permission, it would potentially be challengeable based on, they'll say, well, on what evidence are you basing this particular condition? So I'm not saying members can't do it, but I'll just urge them to be cautious. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, what is your response to that, Councillor Johnson? Do you still feel as though?
I'm being very cautious, and I don't like in any shape or form agreeing to any development which may have an effect on somebody's residential way of life. And, you know, I can see simple things like radios playing 12 hours a day or whatever times this thing is going to operate, which could permeate into the dwelling through. I'm assuming it's a single brick wall between the two.
Is that right? Single brick wall between the two.
I don't know, to be honest, Chair. I don't have that information.
No. Well, look, it's been moved. An amendment has been moved with a condition on it, and it's been seconded. I think on that we take a vote first before we move any further.
Chair, I'd like to speak on the amendment.
Sorry, Chair. I can't make my mind up whether to vote for an amendment until I get my questions answered.
Okay, what is your question, Councillor Allen?
Thank you, Chair. I just wondered, when was the residence converted from a previous warehouse? Sort of how, in other words, how long has it been a residence? And how long has Unit 1 been empty? Because from the papers, it was previously a gym. I've attended many gyms in the past and they are extremely noisy. So that was why I was wondering, how long has that unit actually been empty? So how long has the resident actually had nice quietness, as it were?
Lisa,
thanks, Chair. I don't have a specific data for the conversion of the property at Skern View, but it's at least the last sort of 10 to 15 years, I would have thought, or possibly even more. Those 3 units had permission to convert to a gym in 1995. So quite some time. What's happened during that time in terms of when that use stopped, I don't know, but there has been some enforcement history to those 3 units. Arthur mentioned about the unauthorised use for the storage of, or storage and of used clothing, and the issues that raised in terms of loading and unloading of lorries, and then more recently 2019-2020 permission was granted for the use of those 3 units individually for B8, which is again storage and distribution uses. So that's the sort of potted planning history to the site as far as I'm aware.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, my comment on that is why, when permission was granted to convert to a residence, why was soundproofing not included at that time, bearing in use it was abutted to an industrial unit? I don't understand why it wasn't soundproofed at the beginning, and I don't see why it has to be soundproofed now, to be honest.
Okay, thank you for that, Councillor Allen.
Thank you.
Can we move the amendment that's been moved and seconded by Councillor Johnson?
Chair, could I just answer Councillor Allen's question? It's Councillor Lee.
I think there's still councillors with hands up. I haven't been come to yet, thank you.
Sorry about that. Sorry.
Councillor Lee, what were you going to say?
I was just going to answer Councillor Allen's question. At the time, Councillor Allen, all those buildings were quite derelict and they were quite empty. In fact, they were empty. It can't be quite empty. They were empty. And I was on the planning committee at the time, and an application was made to convert the building into a household, and we had a site visit at the time to have a look at it. And it was quite an incredible application, because the place was very, very run down, and there was a hope at one time, Chair, the person who did that residence made a lovely job of it, and we were hoping at one stage that would permeate through that whole area, but obviously it hasn't. So the question, Councillor Allen, I think when they moved in, there was no one next door. And I think things have just developed from that. But like Councillor Johnson, I think it's wrong for us to approve an application which could create problems to people who have been there along quite a number of years now, and who have stuck their necks out in moving there and doing that building up. And I haven't been down there for a while, but I remember looking after it when it had been done, and they'd made a lovely, lovely job with some kind of patio or looking over the Skern, I believe. So yeah, so I hope that helps, Councillor Allen.
On mute here. I have a number of names which I'm going to take, and then we're going to have to move a vote on that. It's Councillor Toscafin, Marshall, Wallace, Tate, Kerr. Councillor Toscafin.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not sure that a car showroom is a particularly noisy operation if it is used just as a car showroom in terms of vehicles being there for people to come and look around. And the other comment is that if anybody develops a property right next to a residential, to a commercial unit, you've got to expect in time that that commercial unit may be used, and it could be used for any sort of operation. So whilst I would sympathise if there was noise, I don't think the noise is going to be a major consideration in this application. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Marshall.
Thanks, Chair. It's just a very simple question. Has the resident of that residential unit complained about noise in the past? Oh. I would suspect, like Councillor Dustin, if I was developing that against an industrial unit, I would have put some soundproofing in. But has there been a complaint of noise ongoing? That's all my question would be.
Not as far as we know. Is it, Lisa?
No, I don't have that information to hand. I suspect had there been any sort of active or recent noise complaints, that would have been referred to in the Environmental Health Officer's response to the application. So so I'm not aware of any is the answer to that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Wallace.
Thank you, Chair. I find myself very much agreeing with Councillor Toscafin. I think we should note that this was, has permission as a gym. It's in an employment area. It's not in the middle of a residential area. And I think we need to heed Mr. Coates's caution about putting in place an onerous or an over onerous over onerous facility. So I will find myself regretfully voting against the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wallace. And Councillor Tate, you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Lisa, in regards to the resident that lives in that property, are they one of the 3 letters of objection?
Yes, they are, yes.
Yeah, so they're already concerned about noise. Ultimately, we've got a residential property that's there first at the moment, and we're asking to put something different in the building next door to them. So I do sympathise with Councillor Johnson in regards to the noise element. It's a fine balance, getting commercial properties and residential properties, and I imagine as a committee that's something we'll probably have to deal with in the future given the changes in the town centre. So we need to find out where that balance is. In regards to the comment from Arthur, if Councillor Lee is correct and cars will be brought to this premises on one of them trucks, does it make no difference where that truck parks and offloads? Because the answer we seem to get sounded like we were just pushing the problem somewhere else. So if a truck does come to unload them cars to be sold, it's fine if we just push it into a car park down the road, as opposed to doing it outside the property. So that was my comments and questions, please.
Thank you very much. Councillor Johnson, you have moved an amendment, so can you let us know the words of your amendment, please?
Sorry, Chair, can I get a response to?
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I've been on switch off for a while. Yep. Lisa, can you give a response?
I think, if I'm not mistaken, Councillor Tate, your questions were of Arthur, was that right, regarding
one was the offloading of any cars, and I suppose my others were just comments sympathising with Councillor Johnson. We do have a resident in that property, and you've confirmed that resident is actually put in objection, so they are worried about any noise or any activity. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, Councillor Tate. Thank you. Who's Arthur?
Yeah.
Did you want to come in?
Thank you, Chair. Just in response to Councillor Tate's question, I think we're making a certain level of assumption as to how cars would be delivered to the premises, given that the fact it's a small business. It's it's not Bristol Street Motors or something of that scale. I don't think that would necessarily be the case. But again, I think we're dealing with an area that, again, it's industrial use, it's commercial premises. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that we're pushing a problem elsewhere. It would be a legitimate use within that type of area, I would suggest. And again, Chestnut Street car park, it is a dedicated lorry car park. So there is a facility there to make use of. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Arthur.
Yeah,
Lisa, would you like to
response,
sum up,
Chair.
please, on this, and then we'll go to Councillor Johnson for his amendment.
Thank you, Chair. Just very briefly. So, as I explained, it's the change of use of the premises to a car showroom, an internet-based car showroom, where activity would really be on an appointment basis only. We've talked about it being within an employment area, but it's not a use strictly that would meet the requirements of policy EP2. However, there are a number of material considerations that would weigh heavily in terms of its favour that would allow us to set aside those policy concerns. We've discussed some lengthy impact on residential amenity, and in view of its previous use and this use, which is considered to represent some form of betterment, and in view of a number of conditions which are set out in the recommendation in terms of restricting hours of opening, etc. The use is considered to be acceptable in terms of its relationship with the residential properties nearby, particularly the one that adjoins it to the northern side. No particular issues relating to highway safety or flood risk. So the recommendation is to grant with those conditions, restricting hours of opening and other activities, specifically as well, restricting it only to a car showroom. Any of the uses that, or any other use in itself would require planning permission, and we would retain control over that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Lisa. Councillor Johnson, I'm going to bring Paul in now to take over your amendment. Paul, please.
Chair, just for a point of clarification, we're not talking about an amendment here. It's a motion that's been moved. I'm assuming Councillor Johnson is moving officer recommendations together with a condition around sound insulation, in which case I would probably need to have a little adjournment with Lisa and Dave to come up with the relevant wording for that additional condition. But we are talking about a motion. We're not talking about amendment at this point.
Can I just clarify that with Councillor Johnson? Is that correct, Councillor Johnson?
Yeah, I accept that. Yes.
Okay, thank
Chair,
you, Paul.
Chair, if that is, forgive me, Chair, if that's the case, I think we'll be in a rather difficult position for those of us who don't want to agree to that. If there's any, want to agree to that amendment. I think the simpler thing, if it's possible, would be for someone to move the officer's recommendations and then Councillor Johnson's and Councillor Lee's amendment to suggestion to be moved as an amendment. Otherwise, the amendment would be to delete that element from the substantive motion, which is a bit more messy. But I'm in your hands, Chair.
Actually, I think I would agree with you, Councillor Wallace. Does anybody want to move the officer's recommendation?
Happy to do so, Chair.
Sorry, who's doing that? Councillor Wallace? Do you have a second, Councillor Wallace?
Seconded. Second. Oh.
Right, Paul, it's been moved and seconded to accept the officer's recommendation.
Whilst I appreciate Councillor Wallace's wish to tidy this up, from a procedural matter, I would say that Councillor Johnson did move his first and was seconded first. And therefore, if what Councillor Wallace is moving is an amendment, which is the officer recommendation, I'm happy to take a vote on the amendment if that is seconded.
Right, it has been moved and seconded, Paul. Do you want to do that first?
Yeah, that's no problem. So what we have on the table is an amendment, which actually is the officer recommendation, moved by Councillor Wallace and I believe seconded by Councillor Mrs Jones. I will read out members' names and if they can vote accordingly, please. Councillor Allen, are you for or against? For, thank you. Councillor Clark.
For. Excuse me, could you tell us what we're voting for, please?
You're voting for the officer recommendation as moved by Councillor Wallace and seconded by Councillor Mrs Jones, as detailed in the report. This is an amendment.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Cousins.
For.
Councillor Heslop.
For.
Councillor Johnson.
Against.
Councillor Mrs Jones.
For.
Councillor Keir.
For.
Councillor Lee.
Against.
Councillor Lister.
For.
Councillor Marshall.
For.
Councillor McCollum.
For.
Councillor Tate.
Against.
Councillor Tostivan.
For.
And Councillor Wallace.
For.
That's 11 votes for chair, 3 votes against. The amendment now becomes a substantive motion. Thank you.
Okay. Do we take a vote on the substantive motion, Paul?
Yes, I'm happy to, Chair. Yep. So again, the substantive motion now being the officer recommendation within the report, which is to grant planning permission subject to the 6 conditions outlined on page 43 and 44. So again, if I can take a vote, Councillor Allen.
For.
Councillor Clark.
For.
Councillor Cousins.
For.
Councillor Heslop.
For.
Councillor Johnson.
Against.
Councillor Mrs Jones.
For.
Councillor Keir.
For.
Councillor Lee.
Against.
Councillor Lister.
For.
Councillor Marshall.
For.
Councillor McCollum.
For.
Councillor Tate.
Against.
Councillor Tostivan.
For.
And Councillor Wallace.
For.
Thank you very much. So that's 11 votes for the motion, Chair, 3 votes against. The motion is therefore carried. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we now move on to supplementary items? There are no supplementary items. Are there any part 1 questions, members? No. Can we move to part 2, notification of appeals? Can we move those on block? Do I have a seconder for that? Seconded, anybody? Thank you, Councillor Lee. Pursuant to section 100B brackets 5 of the Local Government Act 1972, the public be excluded from the meeting during the consideration of the ensuing items on the ground that it involves the likely disclosure of exempt information as defined in exclusion paragraph 7 of part 1 of schedule 12A of the Act. Paul, can you look at the YouTube, please?
I will, Chair. I'll ask that it is
Thank
now
you.
stopped, and I'll let you know when we